The day my daughter slid a document across her dining room table and told me that keeping quiet was the kindest thing I could do for her family, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not hurt, but clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes after decades of carrying things that were never yours to carry. I had spent years being the mother who showed up quietly, helped without being asked, and stepped back without complaint. I believed that was love. What I didn't understand was that somewhere along the way, my silence had stopped being a gift and started being an expectation. The woman sitting across from me that afternoon wasn't asking for my support. She was counting on my surrender, and the man beside her had built something significant on the assumption that I would give it. I was 68 years old before I finally understood the difference between protecting someone and enabling them. Have you ever realized too late that the person you were protecting didn't actually need protecting? They simply needed you to keep quiet.
The dinner table was set beautifully, the way my daughter always did things. Carefully, intentionally, with attention to every detail except the ones that mattered most. I'd driven 40 minutes to get there, and from the moment I walked in, something felt slightly off. Not wrong enough to name, just wrong enough to notice. She hugged me at the door the way people hug when they're nervous, warm but brief. Her husband, Daniel, shook my hand and asked about my drive, with the kind of easy politeness that had always made him likable. He was good at that, making people feel considered, without actually considering them. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it because it took me years to understand the difference. We sat down to eat, and the conversation moved the way it always did. Weather, neighbors, a trip they were planning. Daniel talked about his work with the quiet confidence of someone who believed in what he was building. My daughter watched him the way she had from the beginning, with a particular kind of attention that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite anxiety, somewhere between the two. I had seen that expression on her face before. I just hadn't known what it meant until recently. 3 weeks earlier, an old colleague of mine had called to ask a casual question. He had come across my name connected to a development project and assumed I was involved. He wasn't suspicious. He was simply surprised I hadn't mentioned it. I told him I wasn't aware of any connection. He paused, then said he must have been mistaken, and we moved on. But I didn't move on. I spent the following days making quiet inquiries. What I found wasn't dramatic. There were no documents spread across a table, no obvious evidence waiting to be discovered. There was simply a pattern, my name appearing in contexts I hadn't authorized, my reputation referenced in conversations I hadn't been part of. Someone had been borrowing something that wasn't theirs to borrow. And that someone was sitting across from me now, asking whether I wanted more bread. I waited until the plates were nearly cleared before I said anything. I hadn't planned a confrontation. I simply wanted an honest conversation. "Daniel," I said, keeping my voice calm, "someone reached out to me recently. They assumed I was advising on your current project." The table didn't freeze. That's not how real tension works. Daniel simply looked up and said, "Oh," with the relaxed tone of someone buying time. My daughter reached for her water glass. "What project?" she asked, and something about the way she said it told me she already knew exactly which one. I wasn't arguing with my daughter that afternoon. I was arguing with a version of reality she desperately needed to believe. "I told him I wasn't involved," I said carefully, "but apparently my name suggests otherwise." Daniel set down his glass. "Mom," just the one word, but the weight she put inside it carried everything she wasn't saying. Don't do this, not here, not now, not to him. I looked at her and understood something I hadn't fully understood before. She wasn't defending him because she believed he was right. She was defending him because admitting he was wrong would cost her something she wasn't ready to lose. That's when she said it, quietly, without raising her voice, with the particular exhaustion of someone who had rehearsed the thought many times without ever meaning to say it aloud. Mom, sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a family is know when to step back. I sat very still, not because the words were cruel, she hadn't meant them to be, but because I realized she had just told me exactly where I stood, not as her mother, not as someone's name and reputation deserved protection, but as a variable, something to be managed when inconvenient. Have you ever had a conversation where you realized the other person had already decided who was right before you even spoke?
For a moment after she said it, nobody moved. The candles on the table were still burning, someone's fork rested at the edge of a plate. Outside, a neighbor's car pulled slowly into a driveway. I noticed all of it because I was doing what I had learned to do over 68 years of difficult conversations. I was giving myself a breath before I responded. Daniel folded his hands on the table with the patience of someone who had learned that silence was often more persuasive than words. He didn't rush to fill the space my daughter had left. He simply waited. And in that waiting, I understood something about him I hadn't fully understood before. He didn't need to argue. He had already won the only argument that mattered. He had won my daughter. "I hear what you're saying," I said, finally, keeping my voice level. "But stepping back isn't the same as being silent about something that concerns me." My daughter exhaled slowly. "Mom, nobody is asking you to be silent. We're asking you to trust us." "Trust is different from compliance," I said. "I can trust you completely and still have questions." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "That's fair," he said, "and we welcome questions. But the timing of this conversation, right now, mid-project, it creates complications that affect more people than just us." He said it gently, reasonably, with the tone of a man explaining something difficult to someone he genuinely respected, and I could see, watching my daughter's face relax slightly at his words, exactly why she believed in him. He made reasonableness feel like wisdom. He made patience feel like generosity. He made my concern feel like interference. I thought about a morning 30 years ago when my daughter was 9 years old and had come home from school refusing to tell me what had happened. She sat at the kitchen table with the same expression she was wearing now, not angry, not sad, just closed. It had taken me an hour of quiet company before she finally told me that her best friend had chosen someone else to sit with at lunch. Such a small thing, such complete devastation. I had held her then and told her that the people who matter will always make room for you. I wondered now if she remembered that. I wondered if I had somehow failed to teach her how to apply it to herself. The hardest part wasn't what my daughter was saying. It was realizing how long she must have been thinking it. That thought settled into me slowly, the way cold does. Not all at once, but steadily, until you realize you've been shivering for some time without noticing. I had been her mother for 40 years. I had shown up in every way I knew how. And somewhere in those 40 years, without either of us marking the moment, my presence had shifted from comfort to complication in her mind. Not because she had stopped loving me, but because loving Daniel required her to reorganize everything else. "I'm not trying to create problems," I said quietly. "I'm trying to understand how my name became part of something I was never consulted about." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but my daughter spoke first. "Mom, She paused, and in that pause I could feel her choosing her words, with the particular care of someone who had rehearsed them without knowing it. We have worked so hard to get here, both of us, and I know you have questions, but right now what this family needs is for the people in it to move in the same direction. I looked at her, my daughter, the 9-year-old at the kitchen table, the young woman at her wedding who had gripped my hand during the ceremony without realizing she was doing it, the person sitting across from me now, asking me to be quiet in the language of loyalty. My daughter wasn't asking me to ignore the truth because she didn't see it. She was asking me to ignore it because seeing it would force her to make a choice, and she wasn't ready to make that choice. Maybe she never would be. I understood that. I even forgave it quietly in the same moment I accepted it. But understanding something and accepting its cost are two different things. I picked up my handbag from the floor beside my chair. I didn't slam anything. I didn't raise my voice. I simply began the small, deliberate movements of someone who has decided. "I love you," I said. "That doesn't change." My daughter's expression flickered. Surprise, then something softer, then uncertainty. "Mom, we're not finished." "I know," I said, "but I am." I said goodbye to Daniel, who stood and thanked me for coming with the composure of a man who had expected exactly this outcome. I hugged my daughter at the door. She held on a moment longer than I expected. Then I walked to my car, started the engine, and drove home in complete silence. Not because I had nothing to say, because for the first time in a very long time, I had no one left to say it to. Do you think there comes a point when protecting a relationship starts costing too much of yourself?
4 weeks passed the way quiet weeks do when you've stopped waiting for something. I woke early, made coffee, sat with the morning light longer than I used to. I walked the same neighborhood loop I had walked for 12 years, past the same oak tree, the same blue mailbox, the same house with the wind chimes that never stopped moving. Small things, ordinary things, the kind of things you stop noticing when your life is full of other people's urgency and start noticing again when the urgency finally lifts. I missed her. I want to say that clearly because I think people sometimes confuse a mother's silence for coldness. It wasn't coldness. It was the particular ache of someone who loves deeply and has learned, finally, that love alone is not enough to hold a relationship together. Every Sunday, for 11 years, my daughter and I spoke on the phone in the morning. Nothing important, coffee, plans, whatever was on her mind. Those Sunday mornings were mine in a way I hadn't appreciated until they were gone. I still reached for my phone some weeks, halfway through my first cup, before I remembered. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in pieces, each one small enough to ignore until ignoring them became impossible. I learned this later, from her, how a question from a colleague had made Daniel pause in a way she hadn't seen before, how an inconsistency in a timeline had made her ask something simple, and his answer had been slightly different from the one he'd given months earlier, how she had begun noticing the space between what he said and what turned out to be true. Not lies, exactly, not at first, just gaps. Small gaps that accumulated slowly into something she could no longer step over. My own contribution to any of this was modest. When people asked, I told the truth. I wasn't involved in the project. I hadn't endorsed it. I hadn't been consulted. I said these things calmly, without elaboration, without anger. That was all. I didn't need to do more. A version of events built on borrowed credibility doesn't require someone to destroy it. It only requires the borrowed credibility to be withdrawn. She came on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, which surprised me. I had expected a phone call first. Instead, I heard a knock,
opened the door, and found my daughter standing on my front step looking like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally accepted that she couldn't carry it any further. She wasn't dramatic, she wasn't collapsed, she was simply exhausted in the way that only happens when the story you've been defending finally stops holding together. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had done homework as a child, where we had talked through every difficult season of her adult life. She held the mug with both hands, and for a while neither of us spoke. "I kept finding things," she said, "small things, and every time I found one, I told myself it wasn't important, and then I found the next one. I didn't say anything. He wasn't a bad person," she said, and I could hear how much she needed that to be true. He just kept choosing the easier version of things, over and over, until the easier version was all there was. We sat with that for a moment.
Then she looked up. "I kept asking you to make things easier for everyone else," she said quietly. "I never once stopped to ask what it was costing you." That was the moment I reached across the table and took her hand. Not because the hurt was gone. It wasn't entirely. Not because everything was resolved. It wasn't, not even close. But because she was my daughter, and she was finally speaking to me honestly, and that was worth more than being right. "I'm not asking you to forgive me today," she said. "I just needed you to know that I see it now. All of it." "I know," I said. "That's enough for today." The road ahead was long. Trust doesn't return on a schedule. There were conversations still waiting to be had, boundaries still waiting to be set, years of quiet accommodation still waiting to be honestly examined between us. But that afternoon, sitting in my kitchen with the autumn light coming through the window and my daughter's hand in mine, something that had been broken began, very slowly, to consider the possibility of mending. I've thought about it many times since, how the most painful chapters of our lives are rarely about the people who hurt us. They're about what those people reveal, about the relationships we've been maintaining on hope alone, the truths we've been softening out of love, the boundaries we never drew because we couldn't bear the discomfort of drawing them. Sometimes losing the story you wanted is the only way to find the truth you need. Have you ever had to let go of an illusion before you could finally heal a relationship that mattered to you?